Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, as a lot of us have been watching in the news that's coming out of Nigeria, tens of thousands of citizens of that country have come out onto the streets for about 2 weeks now, upwards of 2 weeks now, in fact, against police brutality. This all after the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, known by its abbreviation SARS, was disbanded. But nevertheless, there are accusations that it was involved in torture and a whole host of different sorts of abuse towards Nigerians themselves. At this point in time, it seems the Nigerians are certainly not satisfied with the way the government and authorities have dealt with SARS and those who were members of that squad and the abuses that they carried out on the ground there. It seems that that situation continues to grow. The unhappiness continues to grow across the country as well. And we're going to discuss all of that now with our esteemed panelists who are joining us now. We're joined now by Ovigwe Eguegu, who is the founder of AfriPolitical, which is an African geopolitical intelligence firm. He's also a contributor at Africa Report. He's joining us today from Abuja. Joining us from Ekiti is Dr. Shola Omotola, who is a professor of political science and the dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Federal University of Ekiti. And joining us from Lagos is Nicholas Ibekwe, who is the head of the investigations at Premium Times. Nicholas, Shola, and Ovigwe, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Nicholas, let me start with you. What do you make of these protests at this point in time? I mean, I know it all started after a video came out of the killing of a young man.
This has been it has been a burning issue in Nigeria for quite a number of years now. SARS has these, backlogs of abuses, of sundry abuses, rape, extrajudicial killings, torture, and all of that. People see them on the street every day where they grab people for the kind of clothes you wear, for the kind of hairdo you have. They basically profile you by the kind of phone you use. Users of iPhone are particularly of their interest. If you have an iPhone, you are an internet fraudster or you are a kidnapper. So, like we say in Nigeria, their cup became full after the video of the young man who fell from their vehicle in somewhere in Delta State, Nigeria, went on social media, and people thought they've had enough of this basically a rogue police unit. The SARS is no different from a terrorist organization. If you want to be serious with what they are doing, they don't obey court orders. They have detention. The Nigerian law stipulates that people are arrested for offences should be charged to court within 48 hours. If you need to keep somebody beyond 48 hours, you have to go to the court to seek an extension of that time. But they don't do this, and they keep you beyond 48 hours. Even in cases where courts have given ruling that suspects should be released, they have held on to this suspect. Yeah.
Shola, I wanted to bring you in because, the country is dealing with many security issues, right? So we've had Boko Haram, we've had, of course, other such issues that the country is facing and dealing with as well, and, a whole bunch of other security issues that one can argue are all important and legitimate for these forces as a whole, I'm talking about, not just SARS. Do you think that there is legitimate argument on the part of the government then that it needs to be extra vigilant, extra careful, but then on the other side, of course, then there are concerns about human rights, etc.?
Okay, thank you so much for having me on this important project. I think I agree largely with the first speaker about those important issues he has raised about the question of SARS in Nigeria. I think the other point I just need to add to that is the deep level of corruption that has come to characterize SARS. They arrest young guys on the street for no just reasons, by mere appearance, outlook, the kind of car they ride and things like that. Then they take them to ATM machine to draw huge amount of money from their private accounts. And it got to a point, they no longer even take you to the bank to use your ATM. They go about on their own with POS. So it's so vast, so much so that at any checkpoint you get to and you find those SARS operatives there, you see them operating a mini bank. okay, where they have a POS and they just detect the kind of amount they want to collect depending on the amount of money available in the account of the people. But moving to the broader issue of insecurity and things like that, I think what we are actually experiencing in the country basically has to do with the crisis of leadership and crisis of governance. It's because the government has actually failed at all levels, the federal, the state, and local government level. That is why you see so much anger, so much anguish, so much discontent among the populace. When you look at the statistics that are coming out from the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria, for example, in terms of unemployment, you realize that by the end of the second quarter of this year, that's June 2020, 27.1% of Nigerians are completely unemployed. Then out of those who are even employed, 28.6% of them suffer from underemployment. Okay, so when you put the two together, you are talking about 55.7% of the population. Okay, we are talking about people who are competent, who are qualified, who have the certificate, who are willing to work, but are either unable to secure gainful employment or they are partially employed in a way that their labor is actually being exploited. So I think that is the bigger picture from which we should look at some of these issues we are talking about. So when people are talking about these protests about NSAS, about human rights violation and some contradictions inherent in it, I think it's a reflection of the broader decadence of governance, okay, that has come to envelop the country in the last couple of years.
Okay, Shola, if you just allow me to come in here, because you made some very good points there, and I wanted to, if you allow me, put that to Ovigwe as well. Ovigwe, do you think that for a number of years now, in fact, it can be argued that Nigeria's establishment has been taking a very heavy-handed approach when it comes to security issues or, how to keep the country secure? Because, there's also, if I may bring this in, and I know it's probably an unrelated issues directly to SARS, but there was also that, the crackdown on the Islamic movement in Nigeria as well. And there have been other such crackdowns as well. And there have been, of course, tensions as well, in the country, be it because of terrorism or otherwise. So these are all complex issues, but do you think that the government and authorities and law enforcement overall has taken an approach of just heavy-handedness instead of trying to work with communities?
I think the first two gentlemen made very clear points that there's been an infraction in the social order, and that has been caused by failure of governance at all levels. That is true, and I think they did justice in painting the picture. But if we're looking at a broader picture of what is happening in Nigeria today, yes, the failure of governance, but also particularly the social contract that exists between the people and their government, especially particularly the state. If you look at the Nigerian system is a career deviant, or the security apparatus is a career deviant from what is acceptable. In 1999, there was a massacre in Odi, in Bayelsa State. There's a popular song about that, carried out by the army also. Every decade, you would find massacres. Even there was a massacre in Zaria, I think about 2015 or so, or 2005, not particularly sure. Now you are seeing this in Lekki. But why this continues is because, and even the repression against the Shiites, that was 2018, 2019, thereabout, so many people were killed by the army. And this is not an isolated event, but actually a continuation of state and a testament of state behavior. The state has little regard for life and property. It doesn't matter whether you are in the north, whether you are from the south, whether you are Christian, whether you are Muslims. When the soldiers stormed on the protesters in Lekki on Tuesday, 20th of October, they didn't ask whether they are Muslim or whether they are Christian, whether they're from the south, whether they're from the north. It doesn't matter. They just went on and ambushed the population. This is state behavior, and it is wrong. And if you look at our constitution, the 1999 constitution, it is very clear that the state, all governmental actions shall be humane. This is in clear violation of that. This is in clear violation of even international best practices. But I know the international community would not respond because they've almost lost confidence in countries like Nigeria, or most of the countries that have been career violators of human rights and civil liberties. So in going forward, there needs to be a very clear response from the Nigerian youth, Nigerian population, particularly the youth, that this cannot continue to happen. We need to take concrete steps, to reform not just our security apparatus, but also the approach to governance, the thinking. It has to be in line with our constitution.
Okay, so the clock is quick, best of us, gentlemen. I wanted to give you the final word, Nicholas, before I let the three of you go. On this point of, the divisions that exist within Nigeria, right? So we have different ethnicities, we have people of different faiths that, of course, live side by side and have done so peacefully for a very long time. Nevertheless, it seems that the government, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, has tried to play up those divisions, or that those divisions, for one reason or another, keep coming up. Do you think that what's happening now on the streets of Nigeria is actually uniting all Nigerians from all walks of life, be they Christians, Muslims, after the Zaria incidents, as Ovigwe there mentioned as well?
Quickly, in the past 2 weeks, Nigerian youths have been united, despite the fact that a lot of people, in the north of the country did not take part in this protest. But in the south of the country, people were united, people from different ethnicities were involved in the protest and all of that. But we see a developing story right now. After the Lekki crackdown, people from yesterday are beginning to pass in all kinds of divisive messages on social media, especially WhatsApp. They've been passing that around, trying to frame the conflict as a we versus them conflict. And you can also see that many Nigerian youth are beginning to see through these flaws and immediately are shutting them down on social media. So we have a lot of Nigerian youth out there on social media tweeting and saying that please ignore any of those messages that are being shared around through WhatsApp and other means. They are trying to break our ranks, they're trying to divide us. This is what we are. We are not asking for any ethnically motivated things from the government. Rather, we are saying holistically the police must be reformed and this brutality should come to an end. Yes.
Okay, we'll leave there a word, but we do sincerely appreciate all three of you for your time and insight. I know it was a short conversation, but we tried to get as many viewpoints as we could. We appreciate Ovigwe, Shola, and Nicholas for their time and, of course, for the context that they brought to the discussion. Because, in Nigeria, it's not like heavy-handedness on the part of authorities is a new thing, right? So as Ovigwe there as well mentioned, and it's important for us to point out here, the 2015 Zaria massacre, for example, is one huge example of such heavy-handedness towards one faith group. But nevertheless, this has happened towards others also, and isn't right now happening on the streets of Nigeria towards all Nigerians, regardless of their ethnicity, the walk of life, etc. So as Nicholas there mentioned at the end as well, this is technically and should be, hopefully, uniting Nigerians, in fact, towards then demanding a better Nigeria for all peoples, for all ethnicities, for all faiths, regardless if you're from the north, south, wherever, and regardless of what tribe or not you sign on to. This is an issue that is affecting all Nigerians because the government cannot, using the argument of be it terrorism or the need for security or otherwise, use such heavy-handed tactics towards its own citizens, lock them up, even kill them, in some cases arbitrarily, without any accountability at this point in time. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a study that's been released by the University of Cambridge's new Center for the Future of Democracy, which has found that young people around the world are more disillusioned with democracy right now than at any generation in living memory. Now, we're talking about, of course, a time when we have populist leaders around the world, right? And we talk a lot about right-wing populist leaders, but even left-wing populist leaders are just as important to discuss, certainly. And in this survey and study, it's found that, in fact, populism is the one saving grace, if we may call it that, when it comes to democracy in the eyes of the world's youth, that populist leaders sort of, are helping democracy along. Will that be enough? Because, on the right side, at least, of populism, we can see that there's a lot of hatred coming out towards minorities, immigrants, etc., and people of different ethnic groups as well. Obviously, the obvious factors here are ones that we can probably guess, such as unemployment, economic issues, especially, I would imagine, as we're talking right now, as the world is going through this pandemic, which in many places is now within its second wave as well, and the wealth inequality that is bringing up to the fore, also, especially also in developed democracies around the world. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Roslyn Fuller, who is the author of In Defense of Democracy. She's also director of the Solonian Democracy Institute. She's joining us today from Dublin. Joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida, is Dr. Maria Puerta Riera, who is an adjunct professor of political science and sociology at Valencia College and Ana G. Mendez University. And joining us from Cambridge is Dr. Sir Richard Evans, who is a historian. He is Regius Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Cambridge. Richard, Maria, and Roslyn, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Roslyn, let me start with you. What do you make of this study? I would imagine it's not very surprising to say that democracy right now, as we probably understand it, isn't as appealing to the youth.
Yes, well, I think it's important to emphasize, as this study did itself, that what the question mainly concerned was how satisfied people were with how democracy is performing. And that's a very different question than saying, do you think we should quit democracy as a system?
Of course,
or do you think that there are other things that are better than democracy? So there was actually a Pew Research study done a few years ago that showed that around the world, it was also a global study, there was still very, very high levels of approval for either representative or direct democracy as systems of government. So it's important to remember that. At the same time, of course, as the study has highlighted, there are a lot of grievances that younger people have, whether it be housing prices or job inequality, that are causing them to be dissatisfied with current politicians, but also just to become a little bit disillusioned with the entire democratic process. We do see that when there are candidates that appeal to those issues, for example, Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders in the United States, that we do see young people coming out and involving themselves a lot in those issues. We see that in, for example, referendums in Ireland. We've had referendums on abortion. We've had referendums on a referendum on gay marriage. We saw a lot of people coming out and involving themselves in those issues. So when there's something that does appeal to them, young people are still engaging in large numbers.
Indeed. And Maria, where you're sitting right now, the U.S. elections are very quickly coming up, right? So what are your thoughts about this study? Because it's quite pertinent, isn't it? Where I would imagine that at some level, in fact, the opposite effect may be happening right now in the U.S., or maybe not. What do you think?
Well, this study is not the only one who recognizes that there has been a sort of hopelessness with respect to democracy. But I wouldn't say it's about its values and principles as much as it is about its capability of delivering goods. I think that's the problem. And here in the U.S., you can see it. Some other studies like Varieties of Democracy, which I am familiar with, they have found that American democracy has also been failing in terms of acceptance. And young people find it very hard, not just to make a living. You were mentioning at the beginning, unemployment, housing. We're talking about social mobility. Going to college doesn't guarantee that you will, rise up to following social, well-being, or just imagine how hard it is in this country for a young man who is out of college with a huge student debt. So that hurts all your possibilities to afford housing, for example. Even, the basics. Buying a car, credit here is very important. And if you have student loans, that is really hurting your possibilities. So yes, there is dissatisfaction, but there's hopelessness. People are hopeless that democracy can, in fact, deliver.
All right. So what are your thoughts from your vantage point as a historian? I mean, we're talking about wealth inequality here, unemployment. There's a lot to discuss there about the failures and the legitimate grievances on the part of the youth vis-a-vis developed countries' democracy. So we can talk, of course, about the UK, and we've just had. And we're going through the Brexit process, the trade talks, et cetera, the very contentious talks. What are your thoughts about all that?
Well, I said, yeah. Although I am at Cambridge, I'm not. It's not my study. I was not involved in this study. What it found was that 55% of global millennials, that's people born between 1980 and 2000, were dissatisfied with democracy. And that, I think, I agree with Maria, that is a democracy in principle. But that's not really connected with the rise of populism, which has an appeal much more to older groups, I think, in many countries. Populism is not a help to democracy. Populism is anti-democratic. These are politicians who say that democratic institutions are simply ways of reproducing elites, and they speak for the people. So a classic example of this is the referendum, which is not a particularly democratic institution. Referendums tend, as Mr. Thatcher said many years ago, tend to be the instrument of dictators and demagogues right across the world. It depends on how you frame the question. So that the Brexit process bypassed the institutions of democracy, such as Parliament and general elections, and it was ended up in a vote for Brexit of 37%, just over a third of the electorate. And it was immediately claimed by populist leaders to be a vote by the British people. The populists identify with the people. They say they are the people, and those who disagree are not the people. So I think that is a very dangerous development, and it's something that doesn't align exactly with the fact of younger people being dissatisfied with democracy. Younger people in Britain are overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the EU, and one reason for the dissatisfaction is the fact that Britain has left.
So then, Lynn, how does one overcome this, right? We have populist leaders, and whether we like it or not, they are, as you know, as the word essentially alludes to, they are popular, at least within their base, and they have a very strong support base. So if we're talking about Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, et cetera, they all have a very strong support. So how does one then come to terms with both democracy and populism?
I think this is a very interesting question, and it's really gone to the heart of the matter, because I'm trying to define this distinction between democracy and populism. One's end up in a very self-contradictory mode of argument. Democracy is, at the end of the day, and this has been a trope for a long time, it's always been said to be a popularity contest where people are competing to get the votes of other people. You're competing to get their approval. So this idea that there is a conflict between democracy and populism, and that referendums are not democratic, or that movements like the Five Star Movement, which allow all of their members to vote on many issues, and things like coalition agreements, are undemocratic, is, I think, a very fundamentally false one. So by blocking this so-called populism from flowing into the democratic process, of course, you're coming into a situation where more and more people are simply falling out of that process and don't feel that their voices are being heard. As we have agreed, in democratic societies, we have agreed that every person gets one vote. So you can't say that just because you don't like how someone's voted, that person is now what is called a populist. And I agree, those take many forms. Some populists are right-wing, racist xenophobes. But some people who have been called populists definitely aren't and haven't done anything to deserve that label, yet they're being lumped in the same category. So I think this is part of what's driving the problem, is this attempt to limit the meaning of democracy to something that some people are comfortable with.
Yeah. We just have under 2 minutes, so I'm going to go to you first, Richard, and just under a minute if you can. I wanted you to respond to Roslyn there, because democracy versus populism, how do you see that?
Well, democracy, of course, can be left-wing. Look at Maduro, for example, or look at Venezuela. There are left-wing demagogues, left-wing populists as well as right-wing ones. Populism has resulted in a number of regimes which despise science because they think of scientists as part of the elite who they're against. Populist leaders have been catastrophically bad in preserving the health of their population in the face of the current pandemic. And it's not surprising that the Cambridge survey has found that once populists get into government, they tend to lose popularity. And that's why they grasp, like Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, for anti-democratic means of suppressing opposition, coordinating the media, and in general staying in power by undemocratic means. And that's a reason, I think, why we should be very, very concerned about the spread of populism across the world.
And Marie, the final word, just under a minute. You're again in the U.S. Donald Trump, arguably, of course, a populist leader. He still very much, though, has his support, doesn't he?
Does have support, but within his own base. The problem for him has been that he hasn't grown out of his base. He has fed his base with his own policy decisions and his own rhetoric. But he has, in fact, because of that same interest in keeping his coalition together, young, no college white males. He has lost women, for example, which was a very important part of the electorate. And he has, in fact, there are signs that those senior electors above 65 are also not in droves, but they are, taking some distance from his lately.
Okay.
They have taken distance from his political behavior, I would say. Yes, definitely.
Very well. There's a final word, but we appreciate all three of our guests for their time today and for speaking to us, regardless of their busy schedules. That was Roslyn, who was speaking to us from Dublin, Maria, who was speaking to us from Orlando, and Richard, who was speaking to us from Cambridge. They're sharing their expertise on this study by the University of Cambridge's Center for Future of Democracy, speaking about this disillusionment with democracy in being able to resolve the issues that it has claimed that it can resolve, such as inequality, and of course a whole host of other issues that we can probably list. That doesn't mean that democracy in and of itself is bad. It just means that the way it's played out in many places around the world, especially also in these developed democracies, most importantly, which are always held up as moral examples for the rest of us around the world, that it hasn't actually lived up to all the promises. That especially at this time of the pandemic, we can see wealth inequality ever more clearly in front of our eyes, even in those countries at this point. Unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we then have the rise of these populist leaders that have been rising for a while now. So Five-Star Movement in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Donald Trump in the US, Boris Johnson in the UK. I mean, the list is really quite endless. Is it as simple as saying that democracy and populism are two competing opposite ideologies that cannot coexist? Doesn't one sort of lead to the other and vice versa? That, of course, is the debate which is important and needs to be had for the sake of those developed democracies and the health of their democracies going forward as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Donald Trump administration, which has sued Google for what is now being seen as the largest antitrust case against a big tech company in the past 2 decades or so, more than 2 decades, in fact. The Justice Department says that the company stifled competition by ensuring that its position in the marketplace, i.e. through online search and advertising, was maintained by paying companies, mobile phone companies, to ensure that Google was the default on many of their phone devices, laptops, et cetera, et cetera. The Justice Department officials have even not ruled out the breakup of Google as a whole. And this is certainly a debate that's been happening for a while now when it comes to these big tech companies. And we can also include, of course, others like Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with Dr. Shubha, Ghosh, who is a Crandall Melvin Professor of Law. He's joining us this morning from Houston, Texas. Shubha, thank you very much for your time and for taking your time out, in fact, out of your busy schedule to join us today. What do you make of this lawsuit? Where will this all end, right? Because I remember when we look back at the financial crises that have just recently happened, there was always that argument about banks, right, being too big to fail. So is that sort of the logic when it comes to an organization like Google, or what do you think it's fine for that to be spoken of as something that should be broken up?
Yes, I mean, I think the too big to fail point was made in a different context where the economy was about to collapse. In this particular situation, I think the concern from the Justice Department is that it's just too big, period, that it's stifling competition, especially from startups and smaller companies. The philosophy behind the antitrust law is about competition. And so there is such a thing as just too big, period, under antitrust law. Whether we've reached that with Google is yet to be determined. Much of this, as you suggested, is repeating things that we worked through with Microsoft about 30 years ago when that investigation started in 1990, ending sort of with a whimper in the United States about 11 or 12 years later in 2002. So we'll see how this plays out. It's definitely a long game. The interesting issue is the timing right before the elections. There's some folks who view this as maybe an election move. We'll see how that plays out. But more interestingly, if there is a change in administration, how this lawsuit will proceed with the new administration, if there is one.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up the politics, right, of all this, because we are indeed close to the elections, and one would obviously connect us to that. What do you make of the political impact of all this? Because it's not like Google is a small player, right? I'm sure it lobbies heavily in Washington as well, as do these other big tech companies also. There are certainly then limits, aren't there, on what the U.S. government can actually do? Well,
okay, I'll try to unpack your question. Let me start with the last part of this. This was a 68-page complaint that ended. The complaint itself sort of ended somewhat weakly. There was a discussion of remedies, of course, as happens at every complaint at the end, but it's only half a page compared to the lengthy statement of facts and allegations that were made in the previous 67 pages. And it's not completely clear what the remedies are that the government is seeking here. Certainly, one of the things they've talked about are the structural remedies, which involve some sort of breakup, but they leave that very open-ended. There's obviously some talk about the dividing up or separating the search function from the rest of the company, but there are no specifics in the complaint, nor do they have to be here. But there isn't really even any kind of hint in this complaint about what the end game, might be in terms of remedies. As far as your first question, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on whatever political strategy might be behind this. There were 11 states that signed on, and they tend to be ones that we would call in the U.S. red states or more Republican-oriented states. There has been some talk in the press here about some other states either bringing their own lawsuit or maybe joining this. But those other states tend to be more in the blue camp that we've heard about so far.
The argument on the part of these companies right now, I'm talking about them in general because, a lot of these issues I imagine can carry over into the other big tech companies as well, at least the ones that are in common between them. They say that they're just simply better at competing in the market, and that's why they've come out on top. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's an argument that any company is going to be making. That's certainly the arguments that Microsoft made, that they're dominant because they're good. They did not get this position through any kind of illegal means. And that's certainly true within antitrust law itself. Just simply being dominant or having a large market share is not in itself illegal. But if you look at some of the allegations that were made regarding contracting practices, regarding, as you alluded to, some of the exclusionary uses of, for example, Google Chrome and the attendant search facilities on some of these devices, it does make one ponder. And I think there are some legs to the lawsuit. The main issue, I think, with the complaint, putting aside the politics behind it, is just what exactly the government's legal theory is. They're proceeding on what's known as Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is about monopolization. But many of their allegations also are about illegal contracting. And they do talk, for example, the complaint does about agreements with Apple and certain payouts to Apple. But those aren't really fleshed out, and those would fall more under Section 1, but there weren't really any Section 1 allegations made. So I don't know if, I don't like reading too much into these things. There's already been sort of a cottage industry. There's already been a cottage industry trying to find little hidden messages in this complaint. Some of them are fairly humorous, but maybe there's some thought down the road, depending upon where this administration goes, as far as maybe pursuing Apple. There's already been some lawsuits against Apple, as you know. Yeah. But certainly that's one of the glaring non-barking dogs here in the complaint as to what the Section 1 issues would be and what other companies might be implicated.
As a final word then, Shubha, I wanted to ask, a lot of these companies, of course, I use Google, I'm sure you use Google, and a lot of us do use Google and Facebook and, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. How will this affect us? I mean, if we're going back to the Microsoft example, and, I was probably too young to remember exactly how that may have played out in the ensuing years, but I imagine that a gradual process will be brought in so that it's not too, it doesn't impact, overnight users.
Yes, no, I think you shouldn't view this as sort of this one moment in time where everything will change. I think the antitrust laws, certainly in the U.S., are meant to be more gradual, process-oriented. I think the question is what the world would have looked like if the suit had not been brought. We'd obviously not know the answer to that question. But there is a sense that bringing lawsuits like this are sort of a kick in the pants to the industry. And I think there's some good arguments to be made that Microsoft became more competitive. The browser market, certainly in the 1990s, became more competitive, and the industry itself became more interesting and dynamic. Again, I don't want to make too tight a causal connection, but the suit certainly had a role in it with Microsoft. And I imagine similar things will happen. As we say, we won't know until 10 years down the road, and we can look backward on this. Yeah. But judging from our experience with Microsoft, I think the lawsuit is a good idea to bring. It's still a little bit puzzling, the timing and exactly the legal theory underlying it. The legal theory in Microsoft was well thought out, I thought, and well developed, more so than here, partly because the factual background was a little bit more complicated. It came in the light of previous government interventions, especially a government consent decree. It had some interesting theories regarding connecting, tying the browser to the operating system. Ultimately, the lawsuit did end with a whimper. The court, was very, in terms of legal rules that came out of that case, the court was very deferential to the industry. And that might happen here as well, but it took 12 years to get to that position in Microsoft. And so I would imagine there's a long game here as well.
Indeed. Well, we really appreciate your time out and sharing your expertise with us and putting this in context for us. Shubha, that was Shubha Ghosh speaking to us there from Houston, Texas this morning, discussing the Trump administration's lawsuit against Google in this specific case, saying that, Google has essentially competed in a way where it's actually stifled competition, right, in the marketplace. So it hasn't really competed. It's just ensured that it comes out on top. And by paying, as I said, mobile phone makers that it be the default search engine or even browser on many of the mobile phones, as well as laptops, et cetera. And there's a lot more, of course, there. I'm just generalizing this for those of us who use Google a lot. So, I mean, for us, as I put to Shubha, and Shubha also described, this wouldn't be an overnight change, but nevertheless, you don't want a company that is simply too big. This isn't like, as Shubha there correctly contextualized, not like the too big to fail banks and that financial crisis that we had seen. Nevertheless, the timing is also important to discuss this close to the U.S. elections. What exactly is the Trump administration trying to prove by sort of fast-tracking these sorts of suits at this point in time in such succession? Or maybe this is just the right time to do it, to hold these companies to account regardless of whether or not there is an election around the corner as we speak. And we'll keep a very close eye, of course, on this issue because this impacts all of us at some level, whether we realize it or not. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.